Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Very warm welcome to the event that we co-organized with our dear colleagues at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And today we want to talk about the geopolitics of critical minerals, focusing on our region, the region of Central Asia. My background is in international relations, and we're used to pay attention to fossil fuels, oil and gas when we thought about strategic commodities. Now with the climate change challenge, with the need to decarbonize, with the need to transition to cleaner energy, more and more we talk and we hear about critical materials, critical minerals, rare earths, metals that are needed for the technology necessary for the energy transition. And I'll use here a definition of the US government of critical materials. Critical materials are any non-fuel minerals, elements, substances, or materials that have a high risk of supply chain disruption and serve as an essential function in one or more energy technologies, including technologies that produce, transmit, store, and conserve energy, or critical minerals as defined by the US Secretary of the Interior. And as we know, Central Asian countries sit atop of considerable oil and gas reserves, but also substantial deposits of minerals that are considered critical for the energy transition. And the international importance of the region, the countries of the region, is growing in this regard, and that's something that we are planning to discuss today. And maybe a couple of recent developments to mention. At the US Central Asia Summit last month in New York City, when we saw President Biden meeting the 5 presidents of Central Asian countries and discussing cooperation and so on, the US side proposed to launch a C5+1, that is 5 Central Asian states plus the US, critical minerals dialogue to develop Central Asia's vast mineral wealth and advance critical minerals security. And there is already a Kazakhstan-US working group on economic and trade cooperation in the field of rare earth metals. Earlier this year in March, Kazakhstan and UK signed a memorandum on critical minerals. There is a good amount of cooperation going on between the EU and Central Asia, and especially Kazakhstan. Last November, Kazakhstan and the EU concluded a strategic partnership on raw materials, batteries, and renewable hydrogen, and there is a good amount of cooperation with China. So let's discuss what's going on, what's the dynamics in this regard. Because obviously there are many opportunities. There is a good potential that Central Asian countries have, but also, we already see some tensions and the competition in the area. So it is a dynamic scene. Let's discuss it. Let's discuss these issues, and also let's discuss how the countries of the region can maximize benefits and minimize damage. And we have excellent speakers with us today to reflect on these issues, to share their knowledge and insights. And I'll introduce them in the order I'll ask them to speak. We will start with Dr. Roman Bakulchuk, who is head of Climate and Energy Research Group at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, also known as NUPI. He conducts research on energy transition, geopolitics of critical materials, climate change, investment policy, business climate, economic transition, trade, and the China's Belt and Road Initiative. Roman is a co-founder of the Central Asian Development Institute in Bishkek, a think tank that produces economic and policy relevant research on Central Asia. And Roman has been consulting various governments, international organizations, and so on. He's a prolific writer. He publishes many articles and op-eds and so on. Here I want to flag the book that he co-edited and contributed, I think, one chapter, right, Roman? Contributed a chapter to. The book is called Climate Change in Central Asia, Decarbonization, Energy Transition, and Climate Policy. It's a very important and I would say pioneer contribution to the field. I think it's great that it's in open access. We'll post a link so that you can all have a look. Then we will go to Professor Sofia Kalantzakos, who is Global Distinguished Professor in Environmental Studies and Public Policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Her research centers on the geopolitics of critical minerals, the transition to a net zero future, and the fourth industrial revolution. Her work in particular examines how resource competition in an era of fraught geopolitics has tilted the balance toward more securitized assessments of global interdependence. Her most recent publications include a book, Critical Minerals, The Climate Crisis and the Tech Imperium. It also came out this year, so congratulations on the new book, and we'll post the link. She also published China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths in 2018 and was revised in 2021. And another book that is quite relevant for our discussion, the EU, US, and China Tackling Climate Change, Policies and Alliances for the Anthropocene, that was published in 2017. A very warm welcome, Sofia and Roman. And without further ado, let's go to you, Roman.
Well, thank you very much, Nargis, for your kind words and kind introduction. It's always been a pleasure collaborating with you on many different issue areas and occasions, and I'm happy that we can have this webinar today, where I would like to share my screen so that you can also see it, because I have prepared a couple of slides. As Nargis rightly pointed out, indeed, the topic of decarbonization and climate change and its impact on Central Asia has not been studied extensively as other topics. We know that there's a long history of Central Asian studies that stretching to the back to the 90s that focus very much on the security agenda and risks for Central Asia, risks stemming from Central Asia, difficult region in terms of having difficult neighbors. And for many years, there was this focus on security studies, while in terms of kind of topics that are getting and increasingly becoming very important, there has been less attention. For example, the role of critical materials and climate change in Central Asia in particular. That's why, this whole research that I'll present today is based on our understanding, and that, the scholarship community working on Central Asia should pay more attention to these topics. So I will present today a couple of our studies that were just recently published. And I hope you can all see my screen. So I'll just start from a very short, this is actually the main article that I'll present, and I wrote it together with my colleague, Indra Overland, where we actually found that Central Asia, despite having many deposits and quite vast mineral resource wells, it actually has been missing in the existing analysis of critical materials. So not only there has been very little research by Central Asia scholars, but also globally, at the global level, we see that Central Asia has not been very much on the radar of the some of the key energy transition trends at the global level. So just to give you a quick overview of what I will go through, we can see my presentation in terms of maybe three main blocks. The first one will be about some of the key numbers, facts about Central Asia, its role and potential, and what can it do in terms of supplying the critical materials for the needs of decarbonization. Second, I will talk about some of the region-specific risk factors, and then also how some of the ongoing and possibly future trends might affect what happens in Central Asia on the ground when it comes to the, for example, global geopolitical risks and also energy security risks that stem from other, kind of global trends and events. And finally, we'll discuss the role of Central Asian resources in the strategic positioning of great powers. We know again that Central Asia has been quite famously branded as a place where big powers meet. Countries like Russia, the United States, China, the EU, for centuries already were seeing the region as strategic. Of course, differently during different times, but in general, there has been this great game going over the region. So we can also try to discuss and elaborate more about what it means in terms of the increasing interest towards the region from other big players. Something that Nargis already mentioned, that we see some recent dynamics and increasing interest from players like the EU, the United States, and so on. So I would like to start with the starting point, why this whole topic is really important, especially in light of what Central Asia has when it comes to resource availability. So according to many different projections, which are put by the International Energy Agency, the World Bank, and many other key players, they all predict an enormous rise for the kind of demand for those minerals. As you can see, some of those minerals, they are used in the production of clean energy technologies. And this simple table shows you that, those materials which are used for solar power technologies, for electric vehicle storage, wind power, and then you see which of those are used. So for example, like copper, iron, lead, manganese are used across several technologies, while some other, like for example, germanium or cobalt or lithium are used just for one type of the technology. And as you can see, the projected demand growth is just enormous, especially for some of the minerals. And this, of course, makes it so that there'll be increasing demand for those minerals by 2030, 2040, and also going forward, especially if we talk about meeting the Paris Agreement goals, as well as the carbon neutrality and reaching like this net kind of zero future. So we see that it's extremely high demand growth, which makes places like, for example, Central Asia, Latin America, and many others extremely important in terms of the potential supply and delivery of those minerals. If we look at the geological distribution of resources, we see that actually out of those, there are different estimates and also different definitions of criticality. And I'm very glad that Nargis presented some of the definitions, saving my time so that I don't have to go into it. But the point is that many different stakeholders and organizations, they use different approaches to criticality, but most of them agree in the sense that, there is this specific list of minerals which are defined as being very critical. And out of the, I think according to last estimates, at least in this work that I'm presenting, we used the estimate from the International Institute for Security Studies, and they actually put 29 critical materials as being very critical for the purpose of the energy transition. And we see that 22 of them are actually present and available in some mineable quantities in Central Asia. And especially Kazakhstan is endowed with most of them. So you see that this red color shows the high concentration of each specific mineral, and then you see the orange color, meaning that it's moderate, and also low, which also means that even though, for example, some of the minerals can have very low potential, this doesn't exclude them from being mined. So it's still possible to use different technologies to mine those minerals. And then if you look at the total share of Central Asia, when it comes to the global composition and distribution of those reserves, you will see that in some areas, Central Asia is really having a very sizable share, especially when it comes to, for example, manganese ore or chromium, which is mainly concentrated in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is the second largest country in terms of the resources and also the production of this important mineral. Then if you also look at other minerals like lead, zinc, titanium, they're also in quite, I would say, quite significant shares, which also means that, especially given this, rapidly growing demand for minerals, it means that even if some of the minerals are presented in a somewhat relatively small quantities, they're still very valuable and they can still fill some of the global gaps for these minerals. The second important point when it comes to Central Asia and its positioning is that, unlike some other regions in the world, so Central Asia has its importance in a way that its importance lies in the diversity of its mineral base. As I told you, it has 22 different minerals, and most of them can be mined. So, which means that Central Asia can be viewed as a one-stop shop. Also, quite an important, consideration for many investors, where you just not focus on one particular mineral, which is very much, for example, the case as in Congo, right, with cobalt. But you have many other minerals. So for that, you already have existing infrastructure to some extent in Central Asia that builds on the Soviet past, but also some investment that went into the sector after 1991. And you also have the long history of geological exploration, and basically you have already existing mines in different places, which should make it quite attractive to many investors to look at it at the region. Plus, of course, its proximity to China. And if we talk about China as one of the key sources of processing of these minerals, it becomes clear that Central Asia can provide some advantages to investors in terms of being close to China in this regard. Then in our analysis, we also looked whether Central Asia is seen as being a very strategic and important player for the global energy transition in terms of critical materials. And we found that it's actually just started to be seen as important. So it's not that, there has been a lot of analysis done on countries like, again, China, the US, Canada, you can see also Australia, the Congo, but Central Asia is just, has been very much on the, getting less attention, and mainly Kazakhstan was just part of two studies. But now we see over the last few years, it's not only about the policy cooperation between Central Asia and players like the United States, the EU, but it's also we see the increasing attention from scholars to look at the region and to see, what difference can it make in terms of the global supply chains, and whether, it has any advantages compared to other places. So, and there's also now one can see some, increasing consensus that Central Asia is indeed becoming, and in the future, it's very likely it will be a geopolitical hotspot for critical materials. Now let's get to the second block briefly. So even though, of course, the region has a lot of potential, and it has the existing infrastructure, it has this value of being a one-stop shop, there are some very important region-specific factors that might affect the future of mining, and also they might affect the investment coming to the region. And here we should talk about the aging mining infrastructure. So basically, the whole infrastructure has been under-financed over the last 30 years. And it means that it requires modernizations. And so, of course, investors should also take this into consideration. We know that in some places, especially Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, mining has been a source of contestation for many different reasons, but mainly for the fact of the environmental damage and the lacking, proper evaluation of environmental risks. That later led to some protests against companies from many other countries, like, for example, against Chinese investors, also Russian investors, and many others. So that was a source of contestation. It also means that probably we should talk about sustainable mining, as a tool to really, help Central Asia make the best out of its resources, with actually at the same time mitigating and minimizing possible other risks, especially for the environment. Another very important point is that, Central Asia has been struggling to diversify its economy, especially countries like Kazakhstan, partly also Turkmenistan and others. For many years, there has been this, heavy dependence on oil and gas, exports. And as a result, the economic diversification has been stagnating or it has been very slow. So of course, critical materials can now be seen as an important source for economic diversification, but only, of course, if properly managed, and of course, if there are necessary policies behind the production of those minerals. Especially here, we should talk about some possible technology transfer to the region from big investors, including making Central Asia part of the existing global supply chains. And we also see some more evidence coming from, for example, policymakers in Central Asia. For example, a few years ago, I think the minister the head of the investment agency in Kazakhstan said that, for example, lithium can soon become Kazakhstan's second oil. So basically, there's this understanding that, some of particular resources can become very important and very valuable for the economy. Another risk is, of course, the investment climate, that even though countries have made some progress, of course, compared to the 90s or the early 2000s, there's still more work to do in terms of simplifying the access to the markets and also providing necessary support for mining operations. And together with my colleagues this year, we constructed, like a scheme that shows what are the possible risks, in particular, geopolitical risks, regulatory related risks, and technology risks, according to different stages of production. And I should say that the production of critical materials is often very complicated, and it consists of many different phases and stages, which of course also makes it very difficult to analyze and also to predict how things will develop, because many things depend on technologies. So if new technologies require less input from some minerals, it means that the markets will actually shift towards other minerals, which are more important. And as you can see here, basically Central Asia has so far can be found itself as having maybe some possible risks that relate mainly to exploration, mining, and transportation, while the processing does not take place in the region itself. So, but I think this is something that could possibly be a source of necessary economic diversification if Central Asia negotiates and manages to attract investors who would be also interested, in providing necessary infrastructure for processing, recycling of those minerals. If we use another classification, like the group of different geopolitical risks, and see where Central Asia stands, and this, by the way, comes from our joint work with the International Renewable Energy Agency. It's called IRENA, where we basically worked on classifying different groups of geopolitical risks when it comes to of course, the global supply chains of critical materials. So you can see that from 1 to 3, that's where Central Asia have certain issues to work on and to improve. So this is where some of the risks can be found and present. And also, it's clear that the risk of political instability and social unrest is also very relevant when you look at Central Asia. So now let's get to the third and last block, and that's the role of big players and the positioning of Central Asia vis-a-vis those big actors. I should say that if you look at the facts and, for example, at the trade numbers, also how much investment came from big countries to Central Asia, you'll see that actually China is actually taking and playing a very important role in the region already. When we talk about Central Asia and, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, almost all the focus goes into infrastructure, but I think that there's a little attention that paid to actually also ongoing mining expansion under the BRI framework in Central Asia, but also in other places. Like we know that China is actively producing and extracting resources from Africa and Southeast Asia as well. Also, China is already now the largest investor in the region and imports most of those resources from the region. When it comes to individual countries, for example, Chinese companies dominate the market in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where they actually already bought the majority of licenses for future exploration. So when it comes to all new fields of critical materials, this is where most of the Chinese companies own the licenses, and I think some of them are already ready to invest and start the exploration. And then you see that also when it comes to, for example, Kazakhstan, which is the biggest source of minerals in the region, you can also see that China has been actively increasing its imports from Kazakhstan, and you can see for these 4 selected minerals, for example, and it's quite significant if you look at the total volumes and how far it went, like compared to 2017. And the trend still continues, and we see that while Chinese companies have already made this kind of investment move back after, I think, about 2013, and this is where I think other players are lagging behind. So Nargis mentioned, of course, that the EU is getting increasingly interested in exploration and development of certain fields in Kazakhstan and also other places. Last year, the EU signed the Memorandum of Understanding, which actually in May 19 to 2023, so this year, it's considered to become operational. So this move is seen as very important by some of the EU stakeholders. Even though so far the interest is on Kazakhstan, I believe that there's also consideration to look more closely into what happens in Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan has been actually also doing quite a lot in terms of changing its regulatory framework and allowing access to foreign investors to some of those fields that have been actually closed under the President Karimov. And here just some quotes that kind of shows how important is the cooperation for the EU, for example, dealing with Kazakhstan. And the EU, for example, the Valdis Dombrovskis says that creating higher value added goods that drive economic development is something that is also in the interest of the European Union. So this seems to be like, something that is important in light of the economic diversification that I talked about. When it comes to the US, we also see the increasing interest. Again, as Nargis mentioned, in September, the White House published a communique where they presented the main outcomes from the C5+1 leaders joint meeting. So now there's this plan to launch C5+1 critical minerals dialogue. I think it's planned to be launched next year. Quite an important, I think, development. And according to the White House, they see this dialogue as a platform to catalyze investment and also to collaborate on critical material supply chains in the region. And in this regard, the following organizations from the US assigned the key role to promote this collaboration. So like Development Finance Corporation, the US Export-Import Bank, the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, the US Chamber of Commerce, and many others players, they already have this mandate to kind of start working on this topic. So finally, some of the points to consider also going forward in our discussion. I think that Central Asia is quite an advantageous position compared to other places in the world, as I said before, it's a one-stop shop, it's close to China, so it has this kind of advantage compared to other places. There's also this hope for diversification and much needed investment. And I think that, probably critical materials should be seen as the most attractive sectors for investment in Central Asia going forward. If necessary, investment climate measures and improvements are done. Also, take into account that, for example, the global demand for oil and gas is decreasing and also likely to decrease even further within the next 5 to 10 years. This will also make it very highly necessary for Central Asia to explore other sources of revenue. And of course, critical materials can be just like the next on this list. At the same time, it's still unclear what these new trends and moves from big powers mean for Central Asia and its relations with big powers. Can we see or will we see more geopolitical collaboration competition? That's a very difficult question. So far, it's not clear how these big powers will coordinate on this topic, if at all. And also, I think we should also look at how the global competition over critical materials might affect Central Asia and what would be the implications for the region. And I think this is a topic that my colleague Sofia will cover, and I trust she can give us kind of a lesson on what could be the possible kind of implications for Central Asia, taking into account, the big global competition over critical materials. Here's some links to the publications, which I can also share later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roman. You put a lot on the plate, and you left us with the theme of global competition, and that's where I would want to invite Sophia to share her insights. Well, Roman noted how strong China's positions in the region in this regard already are, and the growing interest of the EU and US. If we sort of look at the global picture, what's going on? There is this competition, global competition, and US, EU, and China, key players. How does Central Asia fit into this, and what the implications for the region you see?
Should I take it from there? Okay, first of all, Nargis, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here with Roman, because we've collaborated in the past and hopefully again in the future. Before I even start what I think I'm going to talk about today, which is I'm going to zoom out and give a bigger picture, I just want us to hold on to some thoughts. I think Roman did an amazing job in telling us what the potential is. Does Central Asia even have critical minerals? What kinds of critical minerals? What kinds of opportunities are there? What are the problems with the infrastructure? How much and of what does Central Asia really have? But he also made a point of saying that this potential makes Central Asia another hotspot. It seems as if we're in the climate crisis, and the climate crisis and our solutions to the climate crisis are also not only creating new challenges. I mean, there's an urgency, but they're also creating a lot of new hotspots. I want to keep this in mind because we say it very easily. Central Asia now has this opportunity to become a key node for the green transition, for the digital transition, except it has to deal with Russia, it has to deal with China, it has to deal with Europe, that has a very strong presence. And now the United States is coming in. I think Roman gave us a lot of that. So I want us to keep in mind the fact that we're discussing a transition that seems to increasingly becoming a source of major hyper competition. So if you can bear with me, I'd like to zoom out and recontextualize what's happening, because I'm a stickler for the wider frames under which we have the discussions, and geopolitics is one such important frame. Now, two seismic economic and technological shifts are taking place. Not only the digitalization, but not only the decarbonization, but digitalization as well. And they're taking place in a climate of extremely fraught geopolitics, centering around US-China hyper-competition. Now, power politics are in fact in such turmoil today that they now trump economic considerations, which globalization had made the paramount rationale for building deeper ties of interdependence and supply chains that crisscross the earth. Today, we have 135 countries that have pledged to work toward a goal of net zero by mid-century. Consensus has finally been reached that the green transition is inevitable and essential. Why? Because we need to try to slow down climate change. I keep saying this because in reality, these are industrial plans, but our target, the reason why we came up with this incredible infrastructure change and shift in our economies is to deal with the climate crisis. Now, this year at COP28, that's taking place in the UAE, the world will take stock of how much has been accomplished. And I think we all probably think it's not nearly enough. So for years, there's been resistance to action. And only after the transition began to make economic sense did it garner the widespread political support necessary to make it happen. It also became the main driver of post-COVID recovery. As Roman said, to make the transition possible, we need a lot of critical minerals. They're highly geographically concentrated and they're vulnerable to disruption. And the amounts that we need will skyrocket moving forward. In some instances, lithium and cobalt may increase by 500% by 2050 to meet clean energy demand alone. Countries have put together a long list of critical minerals, as we've seen, and they're scrambling to ensure that they have uninterrupted access to already available reserves. And they're looking for the most mature mining projects that can come online as soon as possible. I want to underscore mature mining projects that can come online quickly. But now that's no easy feat, because opening new mines takes both time. We're going to need new mines. It needs close to a decade and money that given the price fluctuation of these resources, it's hard to come by, as investors prefer short-term return on investment, which is why we're seeing governments starting to subsidize so much of this process, i.e. the taxpayer is funding the transition. Citizens in many countries are highly opposed to mining in their backyard. Moreover, ESG standards mean that the mining industry is now under a strong microscope, demanding transparency and strict environmental measures for their operations. Especially in countries of the developing world, the fact that so much new mining is needed has prompted heated discussions not only over ESG, but also equity, inclusion, and ecological limits. And this is why we see this conversation and these reports coming out about smart mining. Finally, the green transition has been built on interdependent global supply chains. Only now fraud geopolitics are undermining these ties. Globalization is being questioned. That's an important fact. And major industrial actors who find China's rise a threat, led by the US, I might add, are actively trying to diversify their supply chains or decouple from China, certainly regionalize or reshore or even friendshore important parts of the supply chains for green applications, especially for magnets and batteries. In the case of the technology, that's also a very direct push to limit China's access to the new generation of chips in order to forestall its technological advance over the US and its allies. Now, I want to spend just a moment on the tech because this is a very important development. The outbreak of the chip wars, we're not only having the decarbonization battle over key inputs, but the digitalization also requires key inputs. And the outbreak of the chip wars is escalating as the stakes for AI, 5G, and technological supremacy have become the battleground between two giants. For the past year at least, the United States has targeted China's semiconductor business. Washington, for instance, began to take measures to limit the export to China of the most cutting-edge chips and the equipment capable of making them. And it's, let's say, persuaded some of their allies to set barriers to China's tech industry. In May of 23, Japan announced that it's limiting the export of 23 types of equipment used in a variety of chip-making processes. At the end of June, the Netherlands followed suit and announced that it will limit the export to China of deep ultraviolet lithography machines used to pattern chips. In response this August, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce announced a new export license system for gallium and germanium, two elements that are used to make computer chips, fiber optics, solar cells, and other tech devices. This was seen as a retaliation to the Dutch ban. Then a few days later, the Biden administration announced a new proposed regime to scrutinize and ban some US investments into China that would help Beijing develop military technology. I mean, given the contention I'm trying to reflect here, think about Central Asia's choices in this kind of an environment, right? Now, how have our plans to tackle the climate crisis and digitalize the world economy become so securitized and subsumed in contentious geopolitics at a time when global cooperation is indispensable? First, China's meteoric economic rise and growing influence happened without foregoing the centralized one-party system, nor entirely opening up its own economy in the way the West had envisioned. Number two, the US has gone from superpower to hegemon, and then to becoming an important power in a very changed world. It's an unstable world, a world where democracy is challenged, a world where nations, in Asia especially, have become stronger and pursue their own national and regional agendas, and are building new institutions to rival those created by the West. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 further complicated the already fraught geopolitical landscape, given that China reaffirmed its close relations to Putin's Russia. It drove an even deeper wedge into the world order. It gave way to more securitized assessments of global interdependence, increasingly portrayed as a liability rather than an asset. Interdependence was now weaponized, and countries had best rebuild networks around like-minded nations and allies, like I mentioned earlier. Now, how damaging these moves will be remains to be seen. Sometimes the rhetoric is stronger than the actual policy changes. But what has become clear is that these transitions are no longer confined to the normal parameters of trade competition. They constitute an open and heated rivalry over influence, economic power, supply chains, information, norms, values, and governance. Now, on Union Square in New York City, there's a giant climate clock, and it's ticking fast. Both decarbonization and, to an extent, digitalization are the industrial responses we've come up with to fight climate change and reduce emissions. And transport alone accounts for 30% of these emissions. Now, going back to the main topic, it's clear that we cannot achieve the green transition without critical minerals. And as we said, we need a lot of them. Here is the reality that major industrial nations face in this regard. First, many of them, the US, the EU, Japan, and others, had relied on largely uninterrupted global trade to secure access to these minerals. They could avoid mining in their own jurisdictions and could still secure affordable materials from resource-rich countries. Lithium from Latin America, cobalt from the DRC, rare earths from China. They missed the opportunity to address the looming problem of resource scarcity in a geopolitically contentious world when they ignored the lessons of the rare earth crisis in 2010, even though they discovered that they were 97% reliant on China for these key materials for efficient magnets. They also largely ignored the fact that China had made significant inroads and investments in countries of the developing world, in Africa and Latin America, more specifically, targeting key sectors, among which is the mining sector. Later, with the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, it became clear that China had developed a global vision to embrace Eurasia and Africa and loop in South America. The BRI started as an infrastructure project, but has become much, much more, giving pause to countries that might be wary of China, but could not ignore its economic importance. Now, there's been a lot of attention focused on China and Africa regarding mining and Chinese investment there. And as Roman said, not as much attention to Central Asia. A lot of the attention in the press and the scholarly literature is antagonistic or highly critical of China's footprint. There are good reasons for this. Human rights, labor concerns, rising economic debt, not so green infrastructure projects, to name a few. But I would like to stress that while the US left Africa after the Cold War, China came in and by investing helped create an alternative for financing of projects that in many ways contributed to Africa's growing agency, as it could now negotiate more easily. But the green and digital transitions have rekindled the interest of the US in the developing world in ways that went beyond security and humanitarian aid. Europe never left Africa, but increasingly built a more robust partnership there. It's now looking to more actively engage through the Global Gateway Initiative, putting money in the real economy. In the back of everyone's mind now is how to secure these minerals, but also ensure that China is not encompassing the world digitally, because that would be a game changer. Where are countries looking to secure critical minerals from? Well, as I mentioned before, mining projects are both expensive and take a long time to develop. So first, the emphasis will be placed on expanding the operations of mines that are currently producing important minerals. So existing mines for lithium in South America or Australia, for instance, are taking priority. However, the West is discovering that this is not enough. They need much more and more from other places that satisfy these geographic and geopolitical concerns. Here, I would like to point out that many countries are now announcing that they have the materials needed and that they can become the new areas of extraction for the major industrial actors. They present this as an economic opportunity. We heard some of this from Roman's talk. Recently, for instance, Greece announced that it has rare earths, and Turkey also made headlines with a similar announcement. We need to take all this with a grain of salt. Roman told us that Central Asia could become an important material node in this transition. Gradually, attention is shifting to Central Asia. Not only does the region offer the potential resources for this transition, but geopolitics there are once again becoming the focus of world attention. China is already present in Central Asia. The Belt and Road project, after all, was announced there and signified China's policy of opening up and connecting to the West until the edges of Europe. There is great hope that Central Asia can find opportunity in this transition. It's a key moment, especially in light of Russia's preoccupation with the war in Ukraine. It's also a moment that has raised questions in the region about how to deal with an increasingly isolated, aggressive, and unraveling, I might say, Russia. In this time of regional disruption, Central Asia has an opportunity to further pursue a strategic agenda that gives countries more options and more flexibility. It is a chance to further develop the middle corridor trade route across the Caspian Sea to avoid Russia and provide an alternative, especially as the use of economic statecraft and multiple sanctions have been used to weaken Russia and have made things difficult to manage in Central Asia. It also should become an opportunity for fostering regional cooperation and integration, particularly as Nargis has proposed around the water, energy, climate change nexus. The US is fully aware of this and has upped its collaborations there through the C5+1 dialogue, focusing on the economy, energy, environment, and security. This September, as Ramon mentioned, President Biden proposed the Critical Minerals Dialogue to develop Central Asia's vast mineral wealth and advance critical mineral security. The EU as well has cultivated its relations with Kazakhstan, for instance, and in July of 23 announced new avenues of cooperation in light of the green transition. As it was put, raw materials in exchange for technology and competence. Over the last 30 years, the EU has actively invested in Kazakhstan. The prospects are now exciting economically, though they may raise some of the other issues that ESG standards are meant to tackle. But I would be mindful of the realities behind the announcements. First, of the financing components. If one looks at how the US is approaching the chip wars, it's using economic statecraft and its geopolitical superiority to ensure that its allies decouple from China and invest in new foundries in the United States. But, and this is important, it is not providing the financing for this. Even the Inflation Reduction Act was criticized by US allies as highly protectionist. With regards to China, even though there's a slowdown, Central Asia continues to develop its ties, but I think it can take important lessons from Africa. China's financing has often come with limited transparency, and though the terms might sound attractive, countries run the risk of becoming overextended, only to find themselves in unmanageable debt that undermines sovereignty and contributes to further limitation of transparency and democracy. Those countries of Central Asia that have been players in energy trade now have the opportunity to become important regional actors in the green and digital transition. In closing, I would like to offer some final thoughts. I worry that the green transition in the end is extremely materially intensive and additive. We are transitioning our economies to save the planet, but our first and main concern is to sustain growth, and the kind of growth we're equipped to offer is one that continues to be energy intensive. In plain English, all this is additive. We are not cutting our energy use. We're only diversifying the sources of energy, hoping that these new technologies can give us what we need without increasing emissions, even while we add more energy into the mix. Even the gusto with which countries are looking to become part of this transition, especially those resource-rich countries that are banking on extraction to build their economies and move up the supply chain to add value and create jobs at home, are very much caught up in how the shifting geopolitics offer an economic and political opportunity, not in what it means for the climate crisis overall. My hope is that this green and digital transition does not become just a new scramble for resources that in the end forgoes equity, inclusion, and an opportunity for a sustainable future in the developing world. And I'll leave it at that so we can have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Let me ask two questions, one each, pretty big questions actually. To Roman, well, what would be, in your opinion, smart ways for Central Asian countries to address this issue of, critical materials, extraction of materials, trying to address the challenges of the climate change? And you mentioned hotspot, geopolitical hotspot, but it's also, Central Asia is becoming a hotspot in terms of the climate change. How to use these new opportunities in the conditions of the geopolitical competition. So what would be kind of the concrete steps that you can recommend to the governments of Central Asia, how to proceed? And a question to Sophia. You said that global cooperation issues of climate change, energy transition is indispensable. And I think Central Asians can't agree more with that. And we are in the position when we need this global cooperation, right? Well, what can be the way to have this global cooperation in the in the conditions of these growing geopolitical rivalries and so on? And well, there is a discussion of compartmentalization. I don't know to what extent it's possible. It seems very difficult to pull off. How can the global community, international community proceed? And can Central Asia contribute to this process as one of the regions, that feels the competition and can be damaged by competition strongly? So can I go to you, Roman?
Well, thanks a lot, Nargis. Very important question, I should say, and it's also quite thought-provoking. And well, I think it requires me maybe to show you one more slide, and I think this is quite relevant for my response and also to what Sophia was telling us. I think this time dimension is extremely important when it comes to critical materials. This year, together with my colleagues, we've been doing a study where we try to assess the the difficulty in terms of comparing the new mines versus existing mines, what it takes to invest in already existing and those to kind of start building from scratch. So you see that actually it's quite time consuming to develop one new whole mine for each of those minerals. So this figure shows that how many years you actually need from the first discovery to first production, so to the first delivery to the markets. And as you can see, like for copper, it usually takes 20 years for a new mine. Then zinc, lead, and nickel also take a lot of years basically to develop, compared, for example, to lithium, which is relatively more easily accessible. So this tells us that when we talk about like new mining sites, we should take into account that, well, it will be an extremely long process. And we probably, for the sake of saving the climate, we should really try to accelerate it, and because there's basically little time to invest in new mines. And the good thing about Central Asia, and that's my response to the question, is that it has already the existing infrastructure. It's a kind of one-stop shop, as I said before. So I think what's really necessary for the region is to find a way to improve its regulations, its regulatory framework. Now there's a lot of discussion, for example, in the EU on how to fast-track the issuing of new licenses for the mining companies, while still, keeping high sustainability standards. So is it possible basically to fast track this whole process while also kind of remaining very sustainable? And I think it's possible. And this is what Central Asia could do. It could really, the governments could improve the regulations, all the kind of regulatory frameworks. It can also, I think, improve the market entry. In that sense, the region would be quite different from other places in the world where, as you can see on this figure, it's very lengthy process to kind of establish new mines. This is why I think that's the first step. And the second step is, of course, to try to find a way to not just to be like a source of extraction of those minerals, not just a source of raw materials, but try to create more value added by participating in global value chains. And I think this is where also international partners and investors can assist by providing necessary technology and infrastructure in place. So this is in short. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question before we move to Sophia? But is it a problem? Is permitting a problem in Central Asia? It is a problem in the US, for example, here, right? It's a lengthy process because it needs to be inclusive and communities can say no. Well, Central Asian states are largely authoritarian, and kind of what the government decides basically goes. Is it an issue? And another thing, kind of, if you fast track, how can you make sure that it is sustainable and the kind of the issues of environmental justice, equity are kind of taken care of, addressed? So what is the situation?
Oh, I agree with you. That's relatively easier, for example, in Central Asia. And this also brings me to the point that was raised by Sophia, is that most of the new extraction of raw materials is likely to take place in developing countries, which would just, put additional burden on them, because it's way easier to obtain licenses, get permits, and then start the exploration. But again, there's no guarantee that those new explorations will stick to high sustainability standards and environmental standards. So what I meant is, in terms of fast tracking in Central Asia, is just to, basically to learn from the existing models where it's possible. Also maybe involving the international community to kind of, to assist with elaborating specific standards for example, exploration and extraction that would be, according to the best standards. And so this is where Central Asia can stand out and become like quite an interesting and attractive place, especially again, for the fact that it's viewed as a friend. And again, what Sophia was telling, that there's this, existing concepts of friendshoring or reshoring, so finding new markets based on this, factor of being a friend or not friend. And I think that Central Asia is a friend for all big powers, at least for the moment, and this is great. And I think this is something to build on and make use out of it. Sophia?
I love it, but I'm a policy person, and I have to tell you, what are we trying to solve here? The first question is, we talk about Central Asia, which has mostly authoritarian regimes. What is it that they want to achieve? I mean, we can be sitting here saying, yes, they can achieve sustainable mining in the most efficient way while addressing the climate vulnerabilities of their nations and also being able to balance an incredibly difficult backyard, China, Russia, and the US and the EU. Let's put it this way. These are really difficult equations, especially when there's so much contention. Increasingly, this bipolar narrative is asking countries to pick sides. Now, we can pretend that, Central Asia will find some miraculous way of being beautifully neutral in this situation and sell to China, be with China, but also be in a solution for the US and the EU. All of this will last as long as it's necessary. And the moment that the contention goes to the next level, this may no longer be feasible. But again, I'm sorry to put sort of the wet blanket on the situation, but I want us to also realize that just because a Central Asia can, doesn't mean that it will. And I think we keep talking about the economic potential, the ability in theory to navigate the region, the hotspotishness of the region. And we're forgetting also that these countries need to also become resilient for their own sake and for their people's sake. So the question is, what kind of plan is actually being developed? Yes, there are resources, there are mines, there is financing, there's a lot of dialogue and cooperation. There is a time frame. We understand that. It's a difficult region, but what are the countries actually trying to achieve? Is it the becoming a central node in this highway, a new supply chain, a new corridor? Is it also in parallel moving to really build resilience and climate preparedness, which is beyond emission reductions? It has to do with food. It has to do with landscapes. ecosystems. These are major questions that I think we need to put on the table. And on a practical note, and I think it's something that Roman and I suggested in a previous collaboration, I think that Central Asia politically should try to work with either IRENA or the International Energy Agency. We need sort of a gatekeeper, a major institution that's accepted by all. My preference is for IRENA because it's a newer institution. It's not a product of the West, where these issues of how we're going to all have a share of critical minerals so that we do not create redundancies and a more difficult and a worse environmental footprint. These are issues that need to be addressed, and also how to extract in the best way possible, but also create added value for the economies so that they don't become these holes in the ground that are used by others to create added values for their economies.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it's great that you're putting a wet blanket. I think it's important to be realistic, and the more realistic we are, the more we can benefit from the situation.
Let's put it this way: it's one point of view.
Right. Well, but given that China is, very strong, and its presence is already very strong, and definitely it's not, going anywhere, right? Do you see potential for EU and US to have kind of, meaningful partnerships with the region?
I want to say, because I always believe that, I've written repeatedly that I think that Europe, particularly, and China need to continue to collaborate on climate. I've been very critical of US-China climate leadership because I think it's too embroiled in geopolitics. You cannot possibly disagree on everything and have hyper competition economically and politically and militarily, and then say, oh yes, but we are working together on the climate. I like that the EU is a regulatory power, and that it'll kill us with standards to lighten sort of the atmosphere. It is the one that is promoting the strictest, most comprehensive ESG standards. It is the one that is actually, even though it's not the big tech leader, it's the US and China that are duking it out over this. It's the EU that's stepping in to create standards. I think that the EU Central Asia relationship is a very important one, because I think that the EU is building resilience, it's building alternative supply chains and other relations, but it is not targeting China in the way that the US is doing. For various reasons, we need another webinar to talk about this. But the reality is that I have high hopes for EU Central Asia collaboration, because it is very multifaceted, and the EU is, for all its problems, it's very much a champion of multilateral cooperation, which is what we need. And it strives to keep China talking and at the table. And I do believe that we completely underestimate the role of Europe and the positive influence it can have in building this, so that Central Asia does not become another hotspot of contention, so that they can sort of stay in a place where it becomes part of a solution, not another part of a problem.
Well, I can't agree more. I'm a big believer in the value of EU Central Asia cooperation and closer partnership, deeper ties. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I think we've had a very rich discussion. We received a little bit of criticism from our colleague that we didn't talk much about Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and also we didn't talk about Russia. But let me say that we will definitely try to organize a separate webinar on Russia, and we will definitely be following the situation in all Central Asian countries. With that, let me thank our speakers. Thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights, and I hope to see you again at our events. And let me thank our co-organizer, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and let me thank our team, Data Center team here, Laura and Alison, and of course, thank you to the audiences, both here in the Zoom room and on YouTube.